Ahoy there! Welcome to another video on Super Factory Manager. Today, we're going to be looking at a new cable variant that I've added called Tough Cables, and they are meant to inherit the properties of the blast resistance of obsidian and whatever block they are facaded as. So if you are in a pack with witherproof options, then the intent is that you would be able to facade the block as something that is witherproof and have it inherit that property. Otherwise, its default resistance is that of obsidian, and to ensure that this behavior is working properly, I have added a bunch of tests to my test suite to ensure that the behavior is right. So if we look at what's going on, the things that I'm testing is TNTs, wither explosions, the wither's block break, and the wither skull projectile. So by default, bedrock is able to resist all of them naturally. Obsidian can resist TNT and the wither explosion. So I had a misconception earlier. I had forgotten that the wither block breaking was separate from this. So you may be, if you create a wither cage out of obsidian, it will resist the initial explosion, but then the wither's block breaking behavior will quickly cause havoc. So the tough cable, being the same as obsidian by default, will have the same properties where it will not prevent the wither from breaking blocks, and it will not prevent the skull projectile from breaking them. But if you facade the tough cable as something that can resist these actions, then like facading it as bedrock, it can then resist the block breaking and the skull projectile. So I've created tests to ensure that the behavior is correct. So now we're just going to look at those and have a look. So if we run the TNT tests, then it will spawn a bunch of cable variants. So when we look with the top left here, we see that it is the tough cable on its own, and then facaded as grass, obsidian, and there's a fancy variant for them as well. And then the ones that did get destroyed, these are just normal cables to make sure that the changes that I added to make the tough cables work. You also want to make sure that the tough or the non-tough cables are not now suddenly resisting explosions when they should not. So these tests are for TNT, and then if we look at the chart, there's also wither explosions. So if we run wither, then I'm spawning in a wither and letting it go through the normal boss cycle where it will then do the explosion and we will check if the block survived or not. So in this case, of course, the andesite got destroyed, but the tough cables survived when they should, and then the checks where I spawned a normal cable are being destroyed when they should be. So looking back at the chart, there's also the wither skull projectile. So in these tests, I'm spawning a wither and then immediately spawning a skull projectile that belongs to that wither and checking if the block was broken. So in the code for the wither skull, the wither skull has a on-hit method. So the on-hit method of the wither skull causes an explosion in the level with a radius of 1. And in the code for explosion, it loops through a bunch of blocks, and for each of the blocks, it gets the damage resistance of that block. So it's using a damage calculator, and the wither skulls have the entity-based explosion damage calculator. So that gets the block's explosion resistance and then applies the function to it based on what the source of that explosion was. So if we go back to the wither skull, the block resistance function for the wither skull will check if the skull is dangerous, and if the skull can destroy that block, then it's going to return the minimum value between the blast resistance of the block and 0.8. So if you have something like obsidian that can normally resist an explosion, this function is going to be reducing the blast resistance of that block so that things like obsidian can be destroyed by the wither skull projectiles. And then finally, the wither aggression where it's breaking the blocks. This was a fun one to test. So I've created a situation where we spawn a wither and have it programmatically get aggroed and try and break blocks. So in these tests, we're spawning a wither, and then we're immediately applying a little bit of damage to it to reset the timer on when it will try and break the blocks. And so here we have tough cables that were facaded as obsidian. And because obsidian naturally does not resist the wither's block breaking, then the tough cables also facaded as obsidian do not resist. but when we facade the tough cables as bedrock, then it's able to prevent the wither from getting through. So then we also test normal cables facaded as bedrock and normal obsidian, just to ensure that my expectations of the behavior match reality. So it's good to be able to check that I haven't inadvertently made normal cables blast resistant, and the generation of these tests is also pretty clean. So in the aggression game test, we have this class that is a game test generator, so that extends our whatever, and it has a list of scenarios. So when the generate tests method is called for each of these scenarios, it's going to provide a new instance of the game test class. So this, defined just below, extends our test definition. So for each of these scenarios, which has a name, the supplier for what kind of block it should be, whether or not the block is facaded and what kind of facade it should take, and whether the wall should break. So for these scenarios, when the scenario runs, it's going to make sure that we're not on peaceful mode, because otherwise the wither won't spawn properly. It's going to build and place the walls, it'll spawn a sheep, and it will spawn a wither, and then it will make the wither aggro on the sheep, and then we hurt the wither, because in the hurt method, this will reset the block destroy ticks, so that after 20 ticks after the wither's hurt, it's going to start breaking that wall. And then if we expect the wall to break, then if the sheep is not alive and the wall is not broken, that's a failure. Otherwise, we will succeed when the wall is broken and the sheep is no longer alive. And if we don't expect the wall to break, then after a fixed delay, we're just going to make sure that the wall is not broken and that the sheep is alive. So this test generator stuff makes it easy to create all of these situations. So for example, the exploding cables with TNT and stuff, we just have a list of scenarios where we have an explosion type of either TNT or wither, and the type of block, what facade it should be, and whether or not it should survive the explosion. So through using these generators, we're able to create a bunch of tests very quickly. And then we can test to make sure that things are working as expected. And through creating this, I certainly had my assumptions about wither and bedrock and obsidian and stuff. I totally forgot that obsidian would resist this stuff. So after going through this, now I have this kind of fun test where we're able to programmatically aggro the wither. And I just thought that was neat. So I'm hoping to get the update out soon, but we'll see what happens. Have a good one.